We would like to send out a special thanks to HelloFresh.com for supporting The Trail Went Cold. And we would like to thank you, the listeners, by giving you the chance to receive $30 off your first week of deliveries when you go to HelloFresh.com and use the offer code COLD30. That's COLD30. Enjoy the show. September 7th, 2015. Fridley, Minnesota. After spending the evening at a nightclub, 32-year-old Henry McCabe is dropped off at a gas station by an acquaintance sometime after 2 a.m. Shortly thereafter, Henry's wife receives a phone call in which he sounds like he's moaning in pain and claiming he's been shot, and she winds up recording a voicemail containing unexplained growling noises. Henry does not return home, and his body is found in a lake nearly 2 months later. Since there are no noticeable signs of foul play, the cause of death is determined to be drowning. The circumstances of Henry's death and the explanation for his bizarre voicemail remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got one heck of a strange mystery for you today. The unexplained 2015 death of Henry McCabe. This minisode is being released on November 1st, after we spent the entire month of October covering Halloween-themed cases, but I'm still in the Halloween spirit right now, so why not feature another creepy story? Just 2 weeks ago, one of my annual Halloween articles was published at crack.com titled 6 Utterly Terrifying Unsolved Mysteries No One Can Explain, and Henry McCabe's death was featured on the list. And judging by the reaction from readers and listeners, this particular case made the biggest impression, so I was anxious to cover it on the podcast as soon as possible. Of course, the creepiest aspect of this case is an unsettling phone call Henry made to his wife right before he went missing, which led to one of the strangest voicemails you'll ever hear. I'm going to be playing snippets of the audio in a little while, in order to try and figure out how it might relate to Henry's death. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter mini-sodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new mini-sode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the ultra-bizarre death of Henry McCabe. Our story begins in Minnesota in 2015. Our central figure is 32-year-old Henry McCabe, an immigrant from the African country of Liberia, who works as an auditor for the Minnesota Department of Revenue and lives in the town of Mounds View with his wife Corrine and their 2 daughters. On the evening of September 6th, Henry's wife and daughters were off on a trip to California visiting their grandmother, so he decided to go out to a nightclub in Spring Lake Park and spend the night hanging out with 2 friends, William Pappas Kennedy and Calvin Johnson. Henry would consume a lot of alcohol at the club that night and became fairly intoxicated. In the early morning hours of September 7th, which happened to be Labor Day, the group left the club, and William Pappas Kennedy offered Henry a ride. According to Kennedy, he was planning to drive Henry home, until Henry insisted he drop him off at a convenience store at a Super America gas station located in the town of Fridley, at the corner of Highway 65 and 73rd Avenue. Henry was dropped off there shortly after 2 a.m., and this would turn out to be the last time he was seen alive. However, this would not turn out to be the last time he was heard from. At 2:28 a.m., Corrine McCabe received a call in California which came from Henry's cell phone, and she would be quite startled by what she heard. According to Corrine, she could hear her husband screaming in distress and saying that someone had shot him. Corrine immediately attempted to call Henry's brother, Tim Borber, to tell him what was going on, but only got Tim's voicemail. However, the voicemail wound up recording the last 2 minutes of Henry's call, which contained what appeared to be high-pitched noises of Henry moaning in pain, along with a series of bizarre, unexplained growling noises. Now, the full unedited recording of this 2-minute voicemail has never been publicly released. The only version you'll find online are snippets taken from a news broadcast about this story from KSTP-TV in Minneapolis, which has been posted on YouTube. I'm going to play snippets of the audio from the voicemail for you right now, but unfortunately, you will hear a reporter speaking over parts of it. However, you will get to hear the aforementioned growling noises and get a pretty good idea of why everyone is so creeped out by this story. Here it is.
It's a voicemail unlike anything you've ever heard before. There are 2 minutes worth of noises, bizarre ones, with very little actual talking. Authorities confirmed the disturbing middle-of-the-night call came from Henry McCabe's cell phone. The tortured grunts suddenly stop. There is silence. Then someone, either Henry or another person, says, "Stop it."
Now, you heard them say that the noises in this voicemail are followed up by several seconds of complete silence, and the call concludes with an unidentified male voice saying, "Stop it." Well, this section of the call has never been released to the public, so there's no audio available. Needless to say, Crean was quite disturbed by this, and when she attempted to call Henry back, it went straight to voicemail. When Henry did not return home that night, a missing persons report was filed with the Mounds View Police Department. Multiple searches of the area turned up no trace of Henry, and he never showed up for work again or touched his bank account. His cell phone was disconnected shortly after its final call and not turned back on, though it pinged off a cell tower near Creaky View Park in the town of New Brighton, which is approximately 4 miles east of Fridley. Well, of course, the police questioned William Pappas Kennedy, the last person to see Henry alive, and there were some odd aspects of his story. For starters, Kennedy had Henry's keys with him, which Henry would have needed to get into his house. It also turned out that their other friend from the nightclub, Calvin Johnson, had Henry's wallet and identification in his possession. He claimed this was because Henry had gotten so intoxicated that he took his wallet from him in order to prevent him from buying any more alcohol. But the thing which didn't make much sense was why Henry asked Kennedy to drop him at a gas station convenience store in Fridley, as this was in the opposite direction of where Henry lived in Mounds View. Without a ride, it would have taken him over 40 minutes to walk home from there. If that wasn't enough, investigators checked the surveillance footage from the Super America gas station, and it did not show Henry being dropped off there that night. Kennedy claimed that maybe he misremembered which gas station they were at, and sure enough, surveillance footage was eventually found of Henry being dropped off at a Holiday gas station on Hackman Avenue, which was located just over 2 miles south. But the big question was, what happened to him after that? Well, on November 2nd, there were finally some answers, as a kayaker discovered a body in Rush Lake in New Brighton, and he was soon identified as Henry McCabe. The location was nearly 4 miles east of the Holiday gas station where Henry was last seen. Surprisingly, even though Henry was heard saying he'd been shot during his phone call to his wife, there were no gunshot wounds on his body. In fact, there were no noticeable injuries or any signs of foul play whatsoever. With nothing else to go on, the coroner could only conclude that Henry's cause of death was drowning. But how could this have occurred? Well, investigators did not completely rule out the possibility of suicide. Henry was experiencing financial problems at the time of his disappearance, as he had recently bounced his rent check. He had also just received a negative performance review at his workplace, so could these personal problems have compelled Henry to take his own life by drowning himself in the lake? Or, given that Henry had become heavily intoxicated at the nightclub, is it possible that he could have simply stumbled into the lake accidentally and drowned? Well, the problem is that neither of these scenarios could provide an explanation for Henry's bizarre final phone call, especially the growling noises on his voicemail. But unfortunately, with no hard evidence of foul play, the investigation has since come to a complete standstill, and there are no answers about what actually caused the death of Henry McCabe. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh.com, for supporting our podcast. The Trail Went Cold has teamed up with HelloFresh, and they are offering everyone in our audience $30 off your first week of deliveries when you go to HelloFresh.com and use the offer code COLD30. The life of a podcaster is a busy one, as you have to prepare a new piece of content every single week, so I don't want to spend too much of my spare time preparing a meal each night. That's why I'm grateful for the convenience of HelloFresh, who deliver meals right to your door in an insulated, recyclable package. HelloFresh offers a wide variety of chef-curated recipes that change weekly. I've really enjoyed the meals HelloFresh has sent to me thus far. Just the other night, I had a delicious meal of Vietnamese pho which included delicious enoki mushrooms and fiber-rich kale. The ginger and Thai basil create a flagrant, slurp-worthy broth, and the carrot ribbons add a splash of color. And what's particularly great about these meals is that I won't have to spend all night in the kitchen because the recipes only take around 30 minutes. It's also a great opportunity to try things you would never think to cook on your own, and you can enjoy eating outside your comfort zone. When I cook meals from HelloFresh, I'm always certain that I'll never have to utter those terrifying words, the meal went cold. So once again, be sure to go to HelloFresh.com and use the code COLD30 to get $30 off your first week of deliveries. That's COLD30. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the show. Well, this has definitely become one of the creepier, more bizarre mysteries of recent years, though unfortunately, there isn't much indication it's going to be solved anytime in the near future. It's possible that there is no foul play involved, and Henry McCabe's death was nothing more than a tragic accident, but that voicemail throws everything for a loop. I guess it's only appropriate that along with the Brandon Swanson case, this is now the second time in 3 weeks which I've covered a mystery from Minnesota involving a male who disappeared after a strange final phone call, though the key difference between this case and Brandon's disappearance is that we actually have recorded evidence of this call. But of course, the big issue is that the public does not have access to the entire recording of the voicemail, and the only audio which is available has a reporter talking over it, so until I hear the entire thing unedited, there's no way I can provide a reasonable analysis of the recording. I'm guessing there are reasons why the full version is being kept from the public, so all we can really do is work with what we have. Before I continue, I guess there are 2 wild theories about this case which I should address. The first one is the smiley face murder theory, which in case you haven't heard of it, is based around the suspicious deaths of several young men who have been found in bodies of water in the Midwestern states during the past 2 decades. Since graffiti featuring smiley faces has been found near the locations where many of these deaths took place, it's been theorized that these victims were murdered by the same serial killer or serial killers. Given how some of these deaths occurred in Minnesota, it's tempting to believe that Henry McCabe's death might be connected, but I highly doubt that because, number one, as far as I know, no smiley faces have ever been found in relation to Henry's case, and number two, I have always been very skeptical about the smiley face murder theory to begin with, but that's a tangent for another time. The second theory I want to address, or should I say debunk, is that Henry McCabe was the victim of Bigfoot. Yes, I suppose it's inevitable that this would come up, considering those strange growling noises on the voicemail. I've seen this face featured on websites like Sasquatch Chronicles, and David Paulides, the author of the Missing 411 books, has also talked about it. Paulides is kind of infamous for being one of the world's foremost believers in Bigfoot, and while he's never flat out stated that Bigfoot is responsible for what happened to Henry McCabe, it's been implied. All that being said, even if you think Henry might have been attacked by another dangerous animal not named Bigfoot, and that it's the source of those growling noises, the biggest issue is that there were no injuries found on his body. It does seem pretty likely that drowning was the direct cause of death, but what we don't know is if someone else drowned him. I can see why it's easy to become suspicious of William Pappas Kennedy. I think it's worth mentioning that most of the articles about this case refer to Kennedy as an acquaintance rather than a friend. In an interview, Kennedy himself admitted that he was not close friends with Henry, and that they had never actually hung out together before the evening of September 6th. I can't confirm this, but I have the feeling they might have both been mutual friends of Calvin Johnson, which is why they were all at the club together that night. Kennedy was also an immigrant from Liberia, and had actually been a fairly well-known basketball player there, so it's possible Henry had heard of him beforehand. I initially got a lot of red flags about Kennedy when I heard the surveillance footage didn't support his story about dropping Henry off at the Super America gas station, but of course police did eventually find footage of Kennedy dropping him off at a holiday gas station instead. I think there's a good chance that Kennedy was also drinking heavily at the nightclub that night, so I can understand if he got mixed up about which gas station he went to. The part which doesn't make sense is why Henry would ask to be dropped off there in the first place, since it was a great distance away from his home, and as far as we know, he had no other transportation for getting back there. But in Kennedy's defense, Calvin Johnson was quoted in an article as saying that he personally witnessed Kennedy ask Henry for directions to his house, only for Henry to insist that he drive him to the gas station. Henry's exact words were apparently, "Brother, just drop me to the gas station, I'm going to be fine, this whole area is my area." As you might recall, Johnson took Henry's wallet from him at the club to prevent him from buying more alcohol. It's odd that he'd let Henry leave without giving it back, but it's possible he simply forgot. If there was some sort of weird robbery attempt going on here, I doubt Johnson would have turned the wallet over to the police to begin with. But I am pretty confused about why Kennedy had Henry's keys in his possession, which he needed to get into his house. One thing I've never been clear on is how Henry traveled to the nightclub to begin with. If Henry got drunk, and Kennedy took his keys to prevent him from driving home, then that makes total sense. But if Henry never drove to the club, I see no reason why Kennedy would have his keys. Then again, if Kennedy played a part in Henry's disappearance, why wouldn't he just get rid of the keys instead of turning them over to the police? Here's one more potentially interesting tidbit about Kennedy. I was able to find one article in which Corinne McCabe actually described some of the words and phrases she believed she heard Henry saying during his phone call to her. They included, "They are afraid," "police," and "Pappas." Now, even though Pappas was William Pappas Kennedy's middle name, it sounds like that's the name he went by. In fact, if you do a Google search on the name Pappas Kennedy, you'll actually find a profile for him on a basketball website from his playing career in Liberia. So since Henry used his name, does this mean Kennedy was present while the call was taking place? Well, since we don't know the context of this call, it doesn't really prove anything. This portion was not actually recorded on the voicemail, so we're only going by Corinne's memory, and for all we know, she could have misheard things. One other thing worth mentioning about Liberia is that a violent civil war took place in that country for several years while Henry was living there. Members of the local Liberian American community put forward the idea that Henry's death might have been connected to activities from his home country. Since Kennedy also hailed from Liberia, I guess you could speculate that some sort of violent dispute broke out between them, but I think that's probably a stretch. So let's assume Kennedy is completely innocent and has no idea what happened to Henry after he dropped him off. If that's the case, what did happen to him? There are differing sources out there about the exact time Henry was dropped off at the gas station, but it sounds like it happened sometime between 2:05 and 2:15 a.m., and the phone call to Corinne took place at 2:28. Henry's body was found in Rush Lake, which is about 4 miles away from the gas station, and would take about 1.25 hours to reach by foot, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was near that location when the call took place. However, his last call did ping off a cell tower near Creekview Park in New Brighton, which is still a considerable distance from Fridley. Since we're talking about a window of around 15 to 20 minutes, it doesn't seem likely he could have made it there by foot in that time frame, but what if he climbed into another vehicle right after he was dropped off? Well, in my eyes, the one scenario which would account for a lot of the unanswered questions in this case is drugs. Now, I really hate to accuse Henry McCabe of being a drug user without any evidence. In all the articles I read about this case, everyone had nothing but great things to say about Henry as a person, and denied he was involved in drugs. But quite frankly, I do see some warning signs that something might have been wrong. We know that Henry had recently received a bad performance review at work and bounced a rent check, but in spite of this, he's going out to a nightclub to spend money on drinks, and one of his friends apparently becomes concerned enough about him that he takes Henry's wallet to prevent him from buying any more alcohol. If Kennedy's story is true, and Henry insisted he drop him off at a gas station in the middle of the night which was miles away from his house, then it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Henry was meeting someone to score some drugs. Now, Henry wouldn't have had any money on him to purchase drugs at this point, since he turned over his wallet to his friend, but if he'd forgotten about that, I could see how this might have escalated into trouble. But on the other hand, if Henry got his hands on some very strong drugs that night, this might explain his odd behavior during his phone call. I know that when Henry's body was found, many of the articles stated that a toxicology test was going to be conducted, but I've never found any follow-up on this. So if any traces of drugs were found in Henry's system, they've never publicly released this information. You'll recall that Henry apparently stated that he'd been shot during the phone call, even though there were no gunshot wounds on his body, and he sounded like he was moaning in pain, even though he had no noticeable injuries. But if Henry was on strong drugs, he could have been having vivid hallucinations and genuinely believed he'd been shot. I would not be surprised if that entire voicemail was nothing more than a recording of a man on a serious drug freakout. I guess the only thing which can't be explained are the weird growling noises, but the most common theory is that those might have been the sounds of Henry gurgling while being drowned underwater. But was he drowning because he fell into the water on his own? Or was someone else intentionally drowning him? Well, let's not forget that the call apparently concluded with several seconds of silence, followed by a male voice saying, "Stop it." Of course, this part of the voicemail has not been released, and that's always baffled me because I've never seen any indication about whether the voice actually sounded like Henry or someone else. If the voice wasn't Henry, wouldn't it be beneficial to let the public hear it in case someone might recognize him? If Henry was alone at the time, and the voicemail captured the sound of him drowning accidentally, then there shouldn't be a male voice saying those words. By all accounts, it sounds like Henry's call to Corrine was an accidental pocket dial, so it's not implausible that someone could have been holding Henry's head underwater to drown him, oblivious to the fact that the whole thing was being recorded on voicemail. If this was the case, you'd think you might also hear some other sounds like splashing, but since the entire voicemail has never been released, I can't be certain what else might be there. There's also a question about whether Henry could have made it to a body of water in the narrow time frame between when he was dropped off at the Holiday gas station and made the phone call. While his body was found in Rush Lake, there are quite a few other lakes within the 4-mile radius from the gas station. In fact, Creekview Park, the location where Henry's cell phone ping originated from, has its own creek of water flowing through it, so Henry could have been drowned anywhere before his body was moved to Rush Lake. And of course, if Henry got into a vehicle with someone else, then that would have made it a lot easier for him to travel to one of these lakes or bodies of water during that narrow time frame. But if Henry was murdered, then what was the motive? I don't know. I gotta admit, I really don't know exactly where I stand on this one. If it wasn't for the voicemail, I'd definitely go with accidental drowning, but there are just too many strange things about that recording I can't account for. Overall, I do have my doubts that William Pappas Kennedy murdered Henry, but I still get the feeling that he might know more than he's letting on. I guess the tough thing for Henry's family is that if this was nothing more than an accidental death and no one else was involved, then there's no way they would ever really be able to know for sure, meaning they'll never receive any answers. But I do hope they can get some sort of closure, as I can't imagine how horrifying it must be for Corrine McCabe for her final interaction with her husband to be a phone call like that. I certainly don't think Henry fell victim to Bigfoot or a serial killer that night, but if the man who said "stop it" in that voicemail was not actually Henry, then there has to be at least one other person out there who knows the full truth about what happened. So if you have any information about the unexplained death of Henry McCabe, please call Minnesota Community Policing Services at 651-485-9211. That's 651-485-9211. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. So a big thanks to all my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also have a bunch of new donors we'd like to thank this week, and they are Julia, Marta, Jessica, Laura, and Jacob. So thank you very much, folks. And we'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our recurring monthly donors, and they are Dawn, Amber, Brian, Casey, Ellie, Kathleen, Keisha, Laura, Alice, Clinton, Lewis, Jennifer, and Carol. So thank you so much to everyone. This has been a very generous week. And we've got an exciting new announcement as well. The Trail Went Cold has finally launched an online store, and we are selling our own merchandise for the podcast now, including t-shirts, mugs, and stickers. Just visit our website, trailwentcold.com, and you'll find a button up there at the top labeled Store, so feel free to click it and go nuts. The Christmas shopping season is about to start, and Trail Went Cold merchandise would make a pretty cool holiday gift. And before we close things off, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, American Crimecast.
Hello, I am Private Investigator Shane Waters, host of the American Crimecast podcast, where I utilize my voice to speak out for those who have been silenced. From a nurse whose body was found hogtied but ruled a suicide, to a John Doe whose body was mutilated and dumped into a septic tank, I speak out for them all. Join me at accproductions.org. See you there.
I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who provides the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a private Facebook discussion group for The Trail Went Cold, so if you want to discuss the podcast or its featured cases with myself or your fellow listeners, feel free to join the group at any time, and I'll approve your entry ASAP. Like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.